We are starting chapter 9 today. There's a lot in here, so I don't expect to get through the whole thing. Barclay starts out doing a brief overview of chapter 9, and he points out that Matthew's gospel is very well planned and well laid out, and that we see the first shadows of the gathering storm. The opposition is beginning to grow. We see the first hint of the charges to be leveled against him. Number one, he's accused of blasphemy. He claims to do those things that only God can do. Jesus was accused because he spoke with the voice of God. Blasphemy literally means to insult or to slander. And the enemies accused him of insulting God because he claimed for himself the very powers of God. Number two, he's accused of immorality because he hangs out with people that the proper Jews would not have had anything to do with. Number three, he is accused of slackness and piety. We talked about this last week. He doesn't observe the Sabbath properly. And number four, he's accused of being in league with the devil. We see him cure a dumb man, and his enemies ascribe his powers coming from the devil. We must be cautious. This may well be the work of the devil and not as God. It's a strange fact that when people meet something they don't like and they don't understand, they often ascribe it to the devil and not to God. So we're going to start. The first section is verses 1 through 8. Would somebody be willing to read those verses?
Sure.
Okay.
Jesus embarked on the boat and crossed to the other side and came to his own town. And look you, they brought to him a paralyzed man lying on a bed. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Courage, child, your sins are forgiven." And look you, some of the scribes said to themselves, "This fellow is blaspheming." Jesus knew their thoughts. "Why," he said, "do you think evil thoughts in your hearts? Which is easier, to say your sins are forgiven, or to say, rise and walk? But to let you understand that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." And then he said to the paralyzed man, "Rise, lift your bed, and go to your house." He rose and went away to his house. When the crowd saw this, they were moved to awe and glorified God because he had given such power to men.
Okay. From Mark, we learn that this incident took place in Capernaum. And it's interesting to note that by this time, Jesus had been very much identified with Capernaum and called it his own town. So I looked up some information about Capernaum. Very interesting, because some sites make it sound like this tiny, sleepy little town, and other sites say, no, this was a big center of activity. During Jesus's life, it was a garrison town. It was an administrative center and a customs station. It was right on the Sea of Galilee, and was a major entry point into Galilee from Egypt. And that becomes important when we get to the part on taxes. Population was maybe 1,500, and it existed from the 2nd century BC to 7th century AD. So, and the ruins, it's been excavated. The ruins are shared by two different religious groups.
Do you remember what those religious groups are?
I kind of skimmed it. One of them was Franciscans.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember.
Not the original.
No.
Oh, okay. As far as now. Yeah. Okay.
But I do remember they found two synagogues, one on top of the other.
Wow.
But anyway, so going back to the story, Jesus' approach to this man may seem astonishing. He begins by telling him that his sins were forgiven. There's a double reason. In Palestine, it was a universal belief that all sickness was the result of sin and that no sickness could ever be cured until the sin was forgiven. Now, I'd kind of known this, but Barclay put this in terms that was kind of a duh moment for me. It's like, oh, I didn't realize it was total, that it was so absolute that you didn't have one without the other. And so this unbreakable connection between suffering and sin was part of the Orthodox Jewish belief at the time of Jesus. So, so that's why he starts out by talking about forgiving sins. So this is Barclay's thinking about the man that was sick. The man in the story knew he was a sinner because he was a sinner. He was certain that he was, and because he was a sinner, he was certain that God was his enemy. Because he felt God was his enemy, he was paralyzed and ill. And once Jesus brought to him the forgiveness of God, he knew that God was no longer his enemy, but his friend, and therefore he was cured. That somehow was strange to me. Any comments? That you think of God as your enemy? You know, I'm a sinner, so now God's my enemy, and God's made me sick. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that way of looking at things.
It's so foreign. It's so foreign to me because I would never ever think that I was sick because of some kind of demon or devil or whatever other than germs.
Yeah, it's hard to remove my 21st century level of knowledge and get into this way of thinking.
I've known people that, and I guess have been times myself where they felt so, bad about their own behaviors that they felt they were unworthy of God's love or acceptance by God, or, unworthy of anything from God.
Yeah, but to call God your enemy, using the word enemy, just, I didn't like that.
This is trash.
No.
But the manner of the cure is what scandalized the scribes. Jesus had dared to forgive, and to forgive sin is the prerogative of God. So remember, they talked about this is where the blasphemy comes in. Now, I did put a star here. At this point, I like what Barclay says. I actually, this was highlighted for me. So Jesus demonstrated that he was able to bring forgiveness to the soul and health to the body. And it remains eternally true that we can never be right physically until we are right spiritually, that health in body and peace with God go hand in hand. And I know you all have had either knowledge of or maybe personal experience of that mind-body connection. And how strong it can be. And I'll tell once, I don't think I've ever told y'all this story. When first marriage was falling apart, and I found out he was gay in November, and we came home at Christmas, and I begged him that while we were at my parents' house to not do anything to raise any questions because I wasn't in a position to talk about it. And he went out one night, didn't come back till 2 a.m., and I was just horrified. By the time we got back to Mississippi, I opened the car door to get out of the car. We're in front of our home, and I put my feet on the ground and went to stand up and fell in the street. I could not walk. I crawled into the house, crawled around the house until he went and got me some crutches. And then he had to take the crutches back and come back with child-size crutches because I was so short. But I went to the doctor. When school started, I could walk, but I was still in severe pain. I went to the doctor and I said, could this be psychosomatic? And the doctor went, oh no, poo, poo, poo. It may be rheumatoid arthritis, but it's so early that your tests are coming back negative. And with a week of the beginning of school, I felt fine. I had to, but I firmly believe, and nobody will ever change my mind, that was a mind-body experience, that I was so horribly upset that I was taking it out on my body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that,
I agree.
You worry yourself sick.
yeah, I was worrying myself sick. Okay, any other comments about that section? Okay, the next section is just one verse, and I'll do this one. As Jesus passed on from there, he saw a man called Matthew seated at the tax collector's table. Follow me, he said to him, and he arose and followed him. And Barclay goes on to explain the tax system that at one point, and this is prior to Jesus's day, but it puts some things in perspective, that people local to the town would buy the position of being tax collector. That Rome actually auctioned off that position. So you could buy the tax collector position, and that enabled you to rob from people.
It'd be like buying into a franchise.
Yeah, yeah. And obviously, this system provided all kinds of opportunity for misbehavior. So Rome had done away with the auction prior to Jesus's time, but still, people didn't like tax collectors because they were locals, frequently volunteering. So they were hated. So let's talk about the taxes. There were three great stated taxes. There's a ground tax by which a man had to pay 1/10 of his grain and 1/5 of his fruit and vine to the government. You could either pay in money or you could pay in kind. So you didn't have to convert. You could just pay the government grain or wine. Not sure how that worked, but you could. There was income tax, which was 1% of their income. Don't we wish? There was a poll tax that had to be paid by every male from the age of 14 to 65 and every female from the age of 12 to 65. There were statutory taxes that could not be used by tax collectors for private profit. But in addition to that, there were all other sorts of taxes, and this is going to sound very familiar to us. A duty of anything from 2.5% to 12.5% on all goods imported and exported. Now, remember I said Capernaum was a place where goods coming from Egypt came into Galilee. So this is where there's lots of import-export business going on here. You had to pay a tax to travel on the main roads, to cross bridges, to enter marketplaces, towns, or harbors. There was a tax on pack animals, a tax on the wheels and axles of carts. We still do that. To purchase goods, anything bought and sold, certain commodities that were government monopolies. For example, in Egypt, the trade in nitrate, beer, and papyrus was entirely in government control. Sound familiar? Some things don't change.
They had those smart cards with your car. What do you call it?
Easy passes.
Easy pass. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, we've just made it technologically more easy, but we're still doing it. The tax gatherers were universally hated.
The one thing that caught my attention was men were taxed from
The
whatever,
age of 14.
14. I thought you said the women were taxed starting at a younger age than the men.
Or,
That didn't make sense to me because the women, as I understand it, I don't know that they had paying jobs or anything. Women were always like property, and you have dowries and all that stuff. That's kind of weird that they would be.
No,
taxed.
women were considered, once they were old enough to be producing other human beings, once you got into the human being production line, then yeah, tax that.
Yeah, but you weren't producing and selling human beings. Well, maybe you were some, I don't know, but anyway, we're off track here, but that just caught my attention. It's like, where did they get the money? You know, what was the deal?
yeah, whatever man had possession of them, I'm assuming had to pay the money. But Claire, one thing that surprises me, 12 was not the age of puberty at that point. I've done some research on this. 15, 16 is more puberty, I had puberty at the age of 12, but we had better medical. So I'm not sure why they picked these ages, because I think they were a little early.
Yeah.
Well, but also by 12, you're able to lift and carry water and haul things and start cooking. Yeah.
Yeah,
You look at our own country, a lot of the pioneer women who went out and, were married when they were teenagers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I think that certainly in pioneer days, that as soon as you hit puberty, you got married. But I think puberty was more like 15, 16. But I like Claire's point. At that point, you are big enough to work like an adult.
Sarah, why do you think it's 15 or 16 and not the 12?
I've actually done some research on it. And you can just Google, puberty over history or something like that, because and what did it was, there was just a very short period of time throughout our history where unwed mothers got shipped away.
Okay.
And so I was looking into that. And if you go back into the early time of our history,
Voting.
teenagers had.
What is a poll tax?
Mhm.
What is a poll tax? That's what the women had to pay.
I'm not sure what, because they certainly weren't voting. So I'm not sure what their poll tax was. But
A people tax.
Tom says a people tax, just I guess that you're a person. But earlier in our history, you finished your education, maybe at 6th grade, you hit puberty, you finished your education, you got a job, and then you hit puberty. So as soon as somebody caught your eye, you got married. Now that's reversed. You hit puberty long before you finish your education, long before you can get a job. And so during our childhood, being an unwed mother was scandalous. So anyway, I'm getting way off track.
And the age of puberty over the past 100 years or so has gotten earlier and earlier. It's like by 6 months every 50 years or 10 years, something like that. But it's.
I want to say every 10 years, because I think girls are hitting puberty at 8, 9, 10 years old now.
Mm-hmm, they are.
And I think I was fairly typical doing it at 12.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So.
Yeah.
Yep.
I think also it has to do with your body has to reach a certain level of, I don't want to say health, but development. And with our better diets and with, science and things like that, we're going to be reaching that age earlier and earlier.
And not just better diets, but also the hormones that are put into the food that we eat.
Right, right.
If you've put growth hormones into cattle and you're eating meat, you're eating those growth hormones.
Mm-hmm.
And they weren't, I don't think the cattle were given those hormones to the level when we were growing up as they are now.
This sounds like in the Jewish Encyclopedia that it's the custom of taxing a population at a certain amount per head. So it could be that the head of the family was required to pay per female child after the age of 12, and male child after the age of 14, a certain annual poll tax or head tax for their family. It might not be the individual person that had to pay it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. So Tom is right. It's a people tax.
Yeah. And it's funny, today we get to subtract off a certain amount on our tax return for every person. And back then it made your taxes go up. Some things do change.
You had more workers in the family.
Yeah.
They go out and get money. So they said, well, we'll tax you after this time, after this age, because they're laborers.
Yeah, I wonder if the ages had to do with by the time a child reached that age, their survivability. You know,
Hmm.
they're going to live into adulthood,
Yes,
make it to 12 or 14.
that
So
makes sense.
Issue over behind the frog.
that's just a guess. So
No, but based on that makes a lot of sense because I think once you got to a certain point, it's like, yeah, you're going to live to be an old person. It was getting to that point that was dangerous.
mhm.
Childhood was not good for your health.
Right.
Okay, so back to the tax collectors. They were notoriously dishonest. Not only did they fleece their own people, but they also did their best to swindle the government, and they made a flourishing income by taking bribes from rich people who wished to avoid taxes which they should have paid. Every country dislikes its tax officials, sometimes to the point of hatred, but the hatred of the Jews was doubly violent. They were fanatical nationalists, but what roused them more than anything was the religious conviction that God was king, and to pay taxes to any mortal ruler was an infringement of God's rights and an insult to his majesty. By Jewish law, a tax gatherer was barred from the synagogue. He was included with things and animals unclean. Leviticus 20:25 says that he's forbidden to be a witness in any case. Robbers, murderers, and tax collectors are classed together. That's some pretty bad company. So, and then he goes on and talks about how Capernaum was the territory of Herod Antipas, and that Matthew probably was not in direct employ of the Romans, but more likely to Herod. And we know how Herod was so thoroughly loved, right? And he talks about how Matthew probably had seen Jesus before, that wasn't, probably wasn't the first time, and that this was Jesus not just seeing a person, but seeing what he could be. And then Barclay kind of goes off and wanders down a path and says, we must note what Matthew lost and found. He lost a good job but found a destiny. And we must note what he left and what he took. Left his tax collector table, but took from it one thing, and that was a pen. And then he goes on to talk about Matthew would have been a person of letters, and that he used that ability to write the gospel. And I'm sitting there going,
I'm like, I went back to it didn't say anything about him taking his pen.
Okay, on page 383.
It meant his talent.
Barclay says that, but Matthew doesn't say that.
Right,
It meant he took his talent with
right, his writing ability.
yes.
And then and this is Barclay. But Matthew had, and this man whose trade had taught him how to use a pen, used that skill to compose the first handbook of the teaching of Jesus, which must rank as one of the most important books the world has ever read. And I'm going, we know better. Shame on you, Barclay. So that gives you some background about how Matthew would have been totally hated. And it makes me wonder how welcomed he would have been by the other 11, people being what they are. But there's no way to know. Okay, next section is verses 10 through 13. Could somebody read that for me?
I'll do that.
Okay.
He was sitting at table in the house, and look you, many tax gatherers and sinners came and sat at table with Jesus and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax gatherers and sinners?" He heard this. "Those who are well," he said, "do not need a doctor, but those who are ill. Go and learn what this saying means. It is mercy I wish, and not sacrifice, for I did not come to invite the righteous, but sinners."
Okay. Barclay makes a fairly big deal out of where is this happening? Is this in a home that actually belongs to Jesus, or is he dining with friends? And is looking into Capernaum, the consensus is that most likely it was just wherever Jesus was staying.
In England because they left out the "the."
Right.
I was joking. It sounds like it was in England because they left out the "the." Usually,
Yeah.
you go to hospital, you
Yeah.
sit at table.
Well, Barclay was British, wasn't he?
Yes.
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah, so you see some of his British language in here. He does do a little bit of etymology on the word for call. The word that's used there is the Greek word kalein, which is in fact the technical Greek word for inviting a guest to a house or to a meal. And he goes on and remembers the parable of the great feast where the rich said no and they brought in everybody else. So it really doesn't matter where this is. It was to the Orthodox scribes and Pharisees a most shocking proceeding. In Palestine, people were divided into two sections. There were the Orthodox who rigidly kept the law in every small detail. And then there were those who didn't bother with the small day-to-day regulations. And the second group was classed as the people of the land, and it was forbidden to the Orthodox to even go on a journey with them, to do any business with them, to give them anything or receive anything from them, to entertain them as guests or to be guests. By keeping company with people like this, Jesus was doing something which the pious people of his day would never, ever have done.
Mm.
And again,
But in Ireland and Scotland and so forth, the gypsies, or they call them travelers, it's like the same kind of people, don't associate with those people.
yeah. And I made a note somewhere in here. It reminds me of my mother saying this morning, my sister, since I was the good one. Birds of a feather flock together.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
If you're spending time, much less eating with these people, what does that say about who you are? And my mother would have said, my mother sounded just like these Pharisees. You're telling the world who you are by associating with them. But I like Jesus's defense. Perfectly simple. He said he went where the need was the greatest. It's a poor doctor who only visits healthy people. And Jesus said, I came not to call the righteous, but the sinners. And he's not saying that there are people who were so good that they didn't need him. He's saying that he's not interested in, and he's not saying that he's not interested in people who are good. He says, I did not come to invite people who are so self-satisfied that they are convinced they don't need my help. I came to invite people who are very conscious of their sin and desperately aware of their need for a savior. He was saying, it is only those who know how much they need me who can accept my invitation.
Mm.
And I always thought that the righteous of his time needed him because they did not accept him. They may have been righteous in their own eyes under the law, but they were not accepting Jesus.
Right. And that lack of acceptance was an indication of how much they needed him. But I want to read that to you again because this was another one that really hit me. It is only those who know how much they need me who can accept my invitation.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful.
Yeah. And I remember being 12, 13, 14, and being in church thinking, I don't get the big deal about sin. I'm not sinning. I'm not murdering. I don't tell lies. I don't cheat. Of course, at that point, I wasn't even dating. I went down the list of the 10 commandments and go, I'm following all the 10 commandments. What's the big deal? Of course, as I've gotten older, I get what the big deal is. But yeah, I thought that was a powerful statement for me.
From what we recently learned in the Sermon on the Mount, that we're really good at doing the 10 Commandments, the things that tell you what not to do.
Yeah,
How good are we at doing the things that Jesus is telling us to do?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, teenagers don't know everything they think they do.
And
So
neither do 60-year-olds.
We're all still learning.
Yes,
yes,
the journey.
Do you want to come up here?
yeah, the mind that's not learning is died. So the scribes and Pharisees had a view of religion which is by no means dead. So the first thing, they are more concerned with the preservation of their own holiness than with helping with another's sin.
Ooh.
I'll go through I have a feeling if we get through this, we will have done something here. Number two, they are more concerned with criticism than encouragement. And I put a note here that this reminds me of my childhood. That I can remember my mother condemning is maybe too harsh a word, but talking about what was wrong with everybody that she saw.
It reminds me of the state of our whole society. Everywhere I turn, every post, every news item, everything is criticizing somebody. Now, that's not always true. I have seen a couple of good things.
Right, but it does seem to be a dominant
Yeah.
approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, because negativity sells, and it's easier to join into a discussion where everybody's condemning something than it is to have to sit and think about the positive things that are happening in the same situation and then have the courage to say something about it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Barclay states, our first instinct should never be to condemn sinners. Our first instinct should be to help them.
Mm-hmm.
But I think our instincts are on the condemning side. Oh, look what he's doing wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's a real challenge in schools. The first instinct is somebody's doing something that's not right, how I should punish it. How the adult should punish it. And it's an ongoing process. Right, Barbara? In schools too. Think, oh, why is this child behaving this way, to sort of try to figure that out first and do problem solving first. So, and that's a challenge that I face all the time to focus on the problem solving first, as opposed to, especially this year, but anyhow.
Yeah, and even at the college level, I can remember that the longer I taught, coffee hadn't kicked in yet, the longer my syllabus got in terms of my policies, my classroom policies. Whatever somebody did last semester that was wrong got put into my policies explicitly, thou shalt not. just to ward it off. It's like, and I couldn't believe how creatively they could cheat or try to game the system. So I had, that list got pretty long at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Because at college, I didn't have the time, because I only saw you for 3 hours a week.
Uh-huh.
You're approaching adulthood. So here are the rules. I expect you to follow them. But I had to spell out the rules a lot more.
Maybe that's what happened with the scribes, why there's so many Jewish laws, that over time, you just got to keep adding them on there. Just
Right.
like their syllabus.
Right. And we have to remember too that not all Jews at the time were like these scribes that are used as examples.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, Kathy, the great courses, on the history of Christianity that you and I watched last year,
Yeah.
the point somewhere in one of the later lectures that for the vast majority of the people who were not near Jerusalem, they didn't worry with all those laws. They just lived their lives. A lot of those laws were specifically for entering into the temple. And if you weren't going to the temple, who cared if you were ritually clean or not?
Uh-huh.
So, so yeah, they were, most of them just didn't worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then the third way that the Pharisees viewed religion, they practiced a goodness which issued in condemnation rather than forgiveness and in sympathy. They would leave people in the gutter rather than give them a hand to get out of it. So that kind of, we've talked around that, but I wrote in the margin, that sounds like the story of the Good Samaritan.
Yeah, one of the first to pass was a priest.
Yeah. And then fourth, they practiced a religion which consisted in outward orthodoxy rather than in practical help. And I could hear my mother saying, "What will people think?"
Well, that was sort of the theme song of the 50s and 60s.
Yeah, she carried it into the 2000s.
Hmm.
I think that was my problem with my mother. She carried that theme to her death.
Hmm.
And
Oh,
when she wanted to tell you were doing something wrong, she could be rather rude about it.
The British sitcom Keeping Up Appearances
Mhm.
comes to mind.
oh yes.
Yeah.
Miss Bouquet.
Yeah. Okay. Next section, verses 14 through 15. Can somebody read that?
I'll read it.
Okay.
Then the disciples of John came to him. Why, they said, do we and the Pharisees fast frequently, while your disciples do not fast? Jesus said to them, surely the bridegroom's closest friends cannot mourn while the bridegroom is with them. But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they will fast.
Barclay tells us that almsgiving, prayer, and fasting were the three great works of religious life. And that the bridegroom's closest friends, the closest translation of that would be children of the bride chamber. And he goes on to talk about what Jewish weddings were like in that time. It was a special time of festivity. The unique feature was that the couple who got married didn't go away for a honeymoon. They stayed at home for a week. Open house was kept. The bride and bridegroom were treated and even addressed as king and queen. And during that week, their closest friends shared all the joys and all the festivities with them. They were called the friends were called the children of the bride chamber. On such an occasion, there came into the lives of the poor and simple people a joy, a rejoicing, a festivity, a plenty that might come only once in a lifetime. So Jesus is comparing himself to the bridegroom. So there's some special things to pay attention in this passage. It tells us that life with Jesus was a life of joy. Something that I particularly need to remember. There's sheer thrilling effervescence of life. Number two, it reminds us that no joy lasts forever. And John's disciples are in a time of mourning because at this time, when John's disciples come to Jesus, John is already in prison. So John's disciples are having a time of mourning. And number three, it's also a challenge, perhaps, to Jesus's disciples. And maybe they didn't say it, but Jesus could be saying to them, you have experienced the joy that following me can bring. Can you also go through the trouble, the hardship of a Christian cross? Not sure I agree with that quite. But and then number 4, enshrined in this saying is the courage of Jesus. He was never under any illusions. Clearly, at the end of the road, the cross is waiting for him. So any comments on that?
Yeah, isn't there another passage somewhere Jesus, there's other times that Jesus talks about, you'll have time to do that after I'm gone, so to speak. That's
Yeah,
a,
when the woman anoints
yes,
him
yeah, yeah.
and somebody's fussing and Jesus goes, no, 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 no.
Mm-hmm.
You only have me for a short period. Okay. But I did like it was new to me in terms of just how big of a joyous occasion the weddings were. You know, growing up Southern Baptist, you know, it's over in an hour, even the reception, because the reception, there was no music, there was no dancing, there was no alcohol. You know, it was cake, punch, mint, and peanuts. And that was it for a Southern Baptist reception. So, you know, and the ceremony itself, you know, so an hour after you walked in the church, people were leaving.
Uh-huh.
That is awesome. I've never experienced that. That is,
No, you haven't?
no, I mean, where I grew up,
Not much anymore, but
where I grew up, there was once on the street I lived on, there was a Greek wedding that spilled out into the streets and went on for 3 days. There was no sleeping for 3 days. I will never forget that.
No,
I can, you know, growing up in North Carolina, I can remember going back to Pennsylvania for a relative's wedding where, and that part of the family was originally from East Europe. And so everybody had made dozens and dozens of cookies. And the cookie table was 3 banquet tables long, you know, and everybody was drinking and dancing and eating. And I was like, whoa.
Oh, wow.
So good morning, Jim.
Good morning.
Glad you
Finally
joined.
blasted in here.
Oh, well, glad you did. Glad
I am too.
good to see you. Yeah, Claire, the Southern Baptist weddings of and I got married in 72, so probably well into the 80s, were very, very tame affairs.
But you did.
Oh,
You had
yeah.
cake, you had a bowl of peanuts, and if you
Uh-huh.
were really fancy, you had homemade mints.
Mints, yeah.
Yeah.
My first one was Southern Baptist, and I can remember aunts coming in, bringing their little plates of the mints, the homemade mints to put on the table. Everybody had to bring that. As you said, you were in and out in an hour, the whole schmear.
Right. Yep. The mints were made out of confectioner sugar and Crisco. Yep.
And food coloring. And food coloring.
And a little bit of mint. Extra.
Now I had an aunt who's aunt by marriage whose mother made those mints, but she made them out of butter, so they were really good. But I think I had the store-bought ones. My mother was working, and you know all the relatives were coming from out of town, so Mama just paid a lady from the church to make the cake, and she just bought store-bought mints and the peanuts and.
Mhm.
So,
Yep, that's, you stood
Yeah.
in line, you walked through the line.
yeah.
You know,
The
bride and
longest-
groom.
The longest thing was the pictures between the ceremony and the reception. That was probably the longest period of time was
Right.
taking pictures.
Mhm. Right.
Yeah.
And Jim, we're just not talking about weddings here. We're actually, there's a scripture involved where Jesus is giving himself to the bridegroom. So that's why we're on the wedding topic.
Well, you mentioned the wedding topic, and there is a Greek pastry and that brought, of course, brought pastries to mind. But there is a Greek pastry that is made by layer after layer after layer after layer, and I don't know the name of it.
Baklava.
Baklava, that's it.
Baklava.
That's it. Now I have to go to the store and find some.
Don't go to the store or go to Bell Greek Restaurant.
They're on
Oh, Lord.
Huguenot.
Yeah, it's
Bell Greek.
The city diner.
it's near River City Diner. But find the Bell Greek Restaurant, and they've got a dessert case. You can just walk in and buy some baklava. They know what they're doing. You don't want it what you buy at the grocery store.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that before, but I didn't know where that restaurant was. What is the name of that? It's near
It's
River
the
City
name-
Diner.
The name of the restaurant is Bell Greek, but it's in the Kroger. You know what? What's the name of the shopping center? It's where the Kroger is on Huguenot Road.
Belgrade. Belgrade.
Belgrade, yes.
Near
Okay.
the Walmart side of that shopping center, isn't it? There's a Walmart over to the right.
Yeah, there's Ruth,
No,
there's
no,
Ruth
no,
Chris on the left. There's
It's
Ruth
at-
Chris, and
Yes.
then that,
Yeah,
and
it's
then
at
on
the
the right,
corner
I don't know
of,
what's on the right.
it's at
Okay.
the corner of Huguenot and Robius.
Yes.
No, it's not quite to Robius. But Jim, if you're on Huguenot coming
Okay,
from Bon Air, you turn in on a road,
okay,
Polo Parkway.
Polo Parkway.
okay.
Kroger is right there. You want to actually turn right. There's a small little strip on the right-hand side of Polo Parkway,
Oh,
right of Kroger.
okay,
And that's where the Bell Greek restaurant is.
Where the
okay.
Starbucks is and I think CVS pharmacy.
Yeah, there's a pharmacy back in there.
I
Yeah.
got you.
Yeah.
I know where you are now.
Okay.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay.
There's another restaurant on 360 that makes it. So if you live that way, I could give you directions to it.
Oh, Lord, more than one set of directions is, I'm not allowed to do that and to eat too much sweets. I'm not allowed to do that.
Come back next week and we'll let Stuart tell you where the second one is. Okay, I'm going to try to get through one more passage here, and I'll read this one. This is verses 16 through 17. No one puts a patch of unshrunken cloth on an old garment, for if he does, the patch which he uses to fill in the hole tears the garment apart, and the rent is worse than ever. No one ever puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wineskins burst and the wine is spilled, and the skins perish. But they put new wine into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And what Jesus is getting at here is that new ideas are stressful for people. And Barclay even goes into new ideas are stressful for churches. And he talks about, now I understood the one with the cloth because back then fabric was not pre-shrunk. So if you put a new piece of fabric to cover, to patch something, when you washed it, the new piece of fabric shrunk and the hole gets worse. But I didn't know what the deal was with the wineskins, but he explains that new wine puts off gas, and a new wine skin is flexible and it can give with that gas.
Yeah,
But an old wine skin has lost the flexibility and will burst when the wine starts expanding. And Barclay says throughout all its history, the church has clung to the old. And he goes through this section, and I'm at the bottom of 392, that within the church, there's a resentment of new that is chronic. We try to change things, and I see this a lot today, especially as churches try to figure out how to bring or how to keep the younger people. I mean, I look around at the people, the young folks that I saw growing up that are now young adults, and they're going elsewhere. And churches are trying to figure out how to change in order to keep them. But change is a nasty word for a lot of people in church. And so how do you stay the church and change?
Mhm.
And I think it's in one of my study Bibles, the interpretation was that the new wineskins was when someone is born again and comes to Christ, they are a new being, and hence the new wineskin.
Mm.
mm,
Yeah, but
Um,
it's a real challenge for the church because, and the church is in a real point of transition, I think. Mainline denominations have really lost a lot in the past 20 years. These non-denominational evangelical churches, a lot of them have really grown, but some of them are starting to falter
Yeah.
now also. So it's interesting.
Yeah, in the
There's a lot
70s,
more
I think it
perspective to
was
see as
Eric
well.
Fromm, I think, wrote a book called Change, and the most significant thing I remember is he said this was in the late 60s. He said that in the future, the most significant change you'll have to adapt to is change itself. And we're now living in that society where everything changes at a heartbeat. And so,
Right.
I'm sitting here thinking as we're talking about the church, I was on the building committee for 150 years and contemplating any change to our sanctuary. Uh, I've been there and done that, and but then I'm thinking on the positive side, look at the changes we've adapted to in the last year. And here we sit, houses apart, and we've adapted, and the change has not been all bad. In fact, in many ways, it's been good. So I think somewhere earlier in our conversation, we're saying sometimes we don't, I forget exactly how it was said, but we see things as negative, but we forget to look at the positive side of all these changes as
Well,
well.
and I think too that even in Jesus's time, his teaching or following his way was so radical. I mean, it was not the easy way to go. He was inviting in and making his friends with people who were tax collectors and whoever knows. He was inviting those in to be his apostles. And that today, what we sometimes have to do, even as a church, is look back to what Jesus was teaching. And it was so radical, it's still radical today. For us to be an accepting group and to accept people in. I've seen so many churches divided just because they didn't want gay people to be in the church, or they didn't want this kind of person to be there or that kind of person. And churches have divided over that. Well, go back to Jesus and see what he was teaching. And that's radical enough for anyone, even today, to look at your church and how is it really following the way of Jesus? And
it's 3 minutes till 10.
yeah.
And on that note,
telling us to
it starts talking in about a minute. So happy Easter to everybody, and we'll see you next week.